This video is brought to you by me.
You want a weird zebra sex mask? I got a weird zebra sex mask.
Or more accurately, a new channel I'm doing called Business Plays. It's business-themed topics like trillion-dollar bills, crazy pyramid schemes, and the biggest business scams in history.
Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Business Play.
It's sort of like the content that I make here, but it's a bit more relaxed, it's a bit more freestyle. Please do check it out through the link in the description below. Consider subscribing and let me know what you think, and let's get into it. This tremendous tale of samurai loyalty and honor goes by several names. It is usually referred to as the Aiko Jiken in Japan, translated as the Ako Incident, or sometimes the Ako Vendetta. It has been featured so prominently in Japanese literature and kabuki theater that it spawned its own genre, Chushingura, or the treasure of loyal retainers. This genre only includes fictional stories based on this historical event. In the West, we know it as the 47 Ronin, the story of 47 early 18th century samurai who lose their master and embark on an ambitious journey to avenge the unjust death of their lord. The tale first made its way to our parts over 100 years after it took place, courtesy of Isaac Titsing, a Dutch merchant and scholar who did business with the Tokugawa shogunate of Japan on behalf of the Dutch East India Company. The event was later popularized by British writer and former diplomat A.B. Mitford, who featured it prominently in his anthropology book Tales of Old Japan. This has become the definitive version of the story in the West, and the one we will mostly be relying on today. Modern scholars opine that while Mitford did do plenty of research for his book and presents a lot of details and descriptions, he also had a habit of over-dramatizing some of the more climactic parts to make for a more exciting story. Even so, today we bring you, as best we know it, the tale of the 47 Ronin. Our story starts at the very beginning of the 18th century. To help you understand it better, we should quickly present a few concepts about feudal Japan. At that time, the country had an emperor, but his role was mostly symbolic. The true power was held by the shogun because he had command over the military. In 1701, when the event took place, Japan was almost halfway through the Tokugawa period, also known as the Edo period, because that is where the shogunate established its seat of power, while the emperor was still based in Kyoto. Edo is better known today as Tokyo. Although Higashiyama was the emperor of Japan back then, the man actually in charge was Tokugawa Tsunayoshi, the fifth shogun of the Tokugawa dynasty. And the shogun exerted his power throughout the land with the help of 300 feudal lords called daimyo. One of these daimyo, and the one pertinent to us today, was Asano Naganori, the third member of the Asano clan to rule over the Ako domain. In 1701, he and another noble named Kamai Korachika were tasked with organizing a reception for some of the emperor's ambassadors who were visiting Edo Castle as part of their service known as the Sankin Kotai. Sankin Kotai was a policy developed by the Tokugawa shoguns to help them keep an eye on their feudal lords and to minimize their resources so they didn't get any funny ideas about revolting. Basically, it meant that the daimyo had to split their time between their own domains and Edo Castle. For several months at a time, every feudal lord took his family and his retainers and went to live in Edo, where he served the shogun directly. His family, and most importantly his heir, stayed in Edo whenever the daimyo left to look after his fiefdom, and they were basically hostages of the shogun to ensure that the lord behaved himself. Moreover, the Edo residence of the lord, plus all the tasks he had to perform for the shogun while he was there, were all paid out of pocket, which meant less money to raise an army that could be used against the shogun. Anyway, it was Asano Naganori's time to perform his Sankin Kotai. In order for him and Kamai to organize a proper reception for the imperial ambassadors, they needed lessons in court etiquette and protocol from one of the shogun's high officials, a man named Kira Yoshinaka, who was essentially a master of ceremonies. Of course, for his services, Kira expected gifts and monetary compensation. Kira and the two daimyo did not get along. We're not really sure why that was. Mitford said that the Edo official was a man greedy of money who wasn't happy with the gifts gifts he received. Other sources said he was an arrogant man who treated the two nobles with contempt and ridicule. Either way, his actions and attitude became too much to bear, but it was actually the other daimyo, Lord Kamai, who first decided that he wanted to kill Kira. He announced his intention to his retainers during a meeting, saying that he had made up his mind and the following day he would strike down Kira after the first insult and then would suffer the consequences. His servants had no choice but to accept their master's decisions, but his counselor looked for another solution. He realized that the only way to get through to the official was with a bribe, so he collected all the money he could and rode off that night to Kira's mansion. There, Kamai's servant presented him with 1,000 ounces of silver plus another 100 for his retainers. The bribe had a miraculous effect on Kira. The next day, he apologized to Kamai for his conduct and from then on treated him with respect. His behavior towards Asano, however, remained unchanged. If anything, it became even worse as Kira was now angry that the lord from Akko didn't follow his fellow nobleman's example. For a long time, Asano Naganori took the insults in silence, but he eventually reached his limit. At one point, Kira pointed his foot and said that the ribbon of his sock had come untied and told the lord to bend down and tie it for him. Although burning with rage, Asano did this, but afterwards Kira continued to mock him, saying that he was a clumsy country boor who did it improperly. And that was enough. Asano took out a small sword called a wakizashi and attacked the official, but only mangled a cut on Kira's face before the guards separated them. Even though the injuries were minor, the consequences were grave. Although he deserved it, Kira was still a powerful official of the shogun, not to mention that any kind of violence was forbidden at Edo Castle. Asano Naganori was condemned to commit seppuku, a ritual suicide by disembowelment. His death also meant the death of his clan. His lands and goods were confiscated while his retainers became Ronin, meaning samurai without masters. Revenge for Asano's death had been expressly forbidden by the shogun, but for some of his men, this mattered little. The Akko daimyo had hundreds of retainers, but 47 of the most loyal banded together with the intent of seeking vengeance on behalf of their former master. Led by Asano's former principal counselor, Oishi Kurensuke Yoshio, they became the 47 Ronin. Now, Kira may have been corrupt, arrogant, and a reprehensible man, but he was certainly no fool. He realized that even with the shogun's decree, some of Asano's former men might feel duty-bound to seek revenge. Therefore, he surrounded himself at all times by a host of guards provided by a daimyo named Yasugi-sama, who was his father-in-law. The Ronin could have attempted to take on Kira and his men in open battle. They were all quite prepared to die for their vengeance, since they realized that even if they were successful, they would most likely be executed anyway. However, what they could not risk was Kira getting away during the fight, as they would almost certainly get only one shot at getting him. Therefore, they needed the Edo official to get rid of his bodyguards, and for that, they needed to convince him that there was no threat. To achieve their goal, the Ronin all pretended to get on with their lives and go their separate ways. Like many of the other retainers who once worked for the Asano clan, they found new professions. Some became merchants, others became carpenters, some even posed as monks. Out of all of them, Oishi went to the greatest lengths to allay Kira's suspicion. As Asano's most trusted servant, he was also the one official feared the most because it was expected of him to seek revenge. Instead, Oishi relocated to Kyoto with his family, where he became a drunkard and a womanizer. He knew he had Kira's spies on his tail, watching everything he did and reporting back to Edo, so he had to dedicate himself completely to this new role, regardless of the shame it brought upon him. He would spend his days in bars and brothels, stumbling drunk through the streets and causing a scene so that everyone would know what had become of Oishi, a once proud samurai of the Akko daimyo. The most notorious incident happened with a man from Satsuma who recognized Oishi passed out in the street. Disgusted with him, he called him fool and craven and unworthy of the name of a samurai. He then kicked and spat on him. Oishi accepted everything. But he then went even further. His wife, although she knew of her husband's plan, could no longer stand the shame. She begged him to show some restraint, but this only served to spur him on even further. He concluded that a man in his position would likely be abandoned by his family. Because his wife knew it was all an act, she did not want to actually leave her husband, so Oishi left her and told her to take the children too. Only his eldest, Oishi Chinkara, stayed by his side, as he was one of the 47 Ronin. And so Oishi carried on. Meanwhile, all of his actions were reported back to Kira, and eventually his dedication paid off. After over a year and a half had passed, the officials started to feel safe again, believing that Asano's former samurai had left their past lives behind them, vengeance and all. He sent most of his guards back to their lord, and once again was only protected by his own much smaller retinue. While Oishi was giving his Oscar-worthy performance, some of the other Ronin did their part by getting jobs in Edo in anticipation of the attack. They observed the layout of Kira's house, looked for places to enter and exit, studied his movements, and gathered information about his retainers. They also started smuggling and stockpiling weapons, which they had to do in great secrecy. As we mentioned previously, not everyone could just walk around Edo armed to the teeth, not to mention that it would have surely raised a few eyebrows if Asano's former retainers, who were now supposed to be craftsmen and merchants, started equipping themselves like samurai again. Things were going pretty smoothly, and once Kira sent his army away and Oishi was no longer being spied on, it was all just a matter of waiting for the opportune time. Almost 2 years had passed since the death of Asano Naganori, but on December the 14th, 1702, the 47 Ronin were ready to avenge their former master. It was a cold, snowy day, and the wind howled with fury. The Ronin lurked patiently in the shadows, waiting for midnight to launch their assault. The night before, they held one final feast together, as the plan was to turn themselves in and accept the death sentence that was sure to come. Of course, this would be after they chopped off Kira's head and delivered it as an offering to their master's tomb. The signal for the attack was the beating of a drum. All the Ronin also carried a shrill whistle with them that they would blow if they found and had slayed the target. The samurai had split into two groups. One was led by Oishi and would charge through the front gate, while a smaller group led by his son would cover the side entrance to ensure that Kira could not slip through their grasp. They knew there would be collateral damage. Killing Kira's retainers was unavoidable, as they would surely try to protect their master. However, Oishi urged his brethren to avoid hunting any women, children, old men, and other physically helpless persons that they might run into. On the night in question, the Ronin leader even sent one of his companions to Kira's neighbors to inform them of who they were and what they intended to do. The messenger assured the neighbors that they were neither thieves nor ruffians, and that no harm would come to them as long as they did not try to interfere. Indeed, the neighbors found these terms perfectly agreeable, and none of them tried to come to the official's aid because, well, none of them liked him. Well, at least that's how it's portrayed in every story. Some historians indicated that the Master of Ceremonies may have been more popular in real life in his hometown because he helped develop farmland and build dikes. With the matter of the neighbors settled, it was finally time to strike. Oishi began beating his drum, and the Ronin stormed the house of Kira Yoshinaka. 10 of the samurai climbed the rooftops, took out their bows, and kept watch on the courtyard to make sure nobody escaped to call for reinforcements. Meanwhile, the frontal assault team, led by Oishi, broke into the main hall, where it was greeted by 10 of Kira's soldiers. A fight ensued, but the Ronin were more prepared and determined compared to the retainers who had just been disturbed from their slumber. Oishi's group managed to take down their opponents without losing a single man. Meanwhile, Oishi Chikara and the other Ronin made their way through the garden and were fighting other guards in the back of a house. Eventually, the two groups reunited and headed towards Kira's private chambers together. As Oishi predicted, some of Kira's men tried to make a getaway and bring word to their master's father-in-law, Oyasugi-sama, who would have sent a small army to eradicate the intruders. However, they were all struck down by the archers prowling the rooftops. There would be no help for Kira on that day. The fight went on until there were only 3 of Kira's retainers left standing, but these were his best samurai. They were Kobayashi, Hachaki, Waku Hendayu, and Shimitsu Ikaku. They were all that stood between the Ronin and Kira's private room, but they proved to be quite a lot to handle. The 3 expert swordsmen defended their points with fierce intensity and even managed to drive the Ronin back. Seeing that his men were tired and starting to lose heart, Oishi shouted at them with rage. They had already forfeited their lives, so why were they shrinking in their resolution now? They should go in there and either kill their opponents or die trying, as fulfilling their master's cause was the noblest ambition of a retainer. He then commanded his son, Chikara, to go and engage the 3 samurai in combat. The young man obeyed his father, picking up a spear and locked weapons with Waku Handayu. Their brawl was too intense to be contained in just one room, and soon enough the two were fighting in the garden. All seemed lost for the younger Oishi when he tripped and fell into the pond. As Waku was getting ready to deliver a killing blow, Chikara drew his sword and cut his opponent's leg, causing him to fall. The Ronin then managed to get up and kill Handayu before he could retaliate. When he went inside, he found that the rest of the Ronin had finally dispatched the other two swordsmen as well. There was nobody left to protect Kira. They raided Kira's private chambers, but all they found were his son. He wielded a halberd and tried in vain to defend his position, but he was too weak and inexperienced to pose a real threat to one Ronin, let alone dozens of them. He attacked and was wounded, but the samurai allowed him to flee. There was only one target they had on their collective minds, so the search started for Kira Yoshinaka. The Ronin split into several small parties and completely ransacked the mansion, but there was no trace of the imperial official. All they could find were weeping women and children who, in accordance with Oishi's request, were left alone. The Ronin felt despondent and at one point even contemplated committing suicide then and there as they feared they had failed their mission. However, while going through Kira's bedroom, Oishi felt that his bed was still warm, which meant that he was sleeping in it when the attack began. Kira had to be somewhere near, so they started a new search. This time around, the samurai were more fortunate. One of them made the inspired choice to take down a large picture which was hanging on the wall. Behind it, they discovered a secret tunnel which led outside to a small courtyard where there was a storage room for firewood and charcoal. At the other end of the tunnel, there were two more guards lying in wait, but they were no match and were quickly struck down by the Ronin. Inside the outhouse, the samurai found an elderly man in his 60s, dressed as a noble. The man refused to give his name, but the Ronin were convinced that they had found Kira Yoshinaka. Oishi was able to confirm the identity of the elderly stranger when he recognized the scar that his master left him during his attack that started this whole chain of events. Despite the Ronin's hatred for this man, it was trumped by Oishi's sense of honor and respect for the traditions of a samurai. He actually kneeled down and bowed his head in deference to Kira and informed him that they were the former retainers of Asano Naganori and they were there to seek justice for their master. He then gave the official the chance of a nobleman's death by committing seppuku. According to some versions, Oishi even produced the same wakizashi that his master had used, but this may be one of Mitford's added elements of dramatic effect. Either way, Kira had no interest in any kind of death, so he kept begging for mercy. Unsurprisingly, given all they went through, this had no effect on the Ronin. Eventually, tiring of the old man's pleas, Oishi forced him on his knees and cut off his head. The Ronin collected Kira's head in a bucket and prepared to leave, but made sure to put out all of the lights so as not to start a fire that might damage the neighbors' houses. With their mission accomplished, the 47 Ronin embarked on a new journey to Sengaku-ji in Takanawa, where their master's grave was located, with the intent of presenting Kira's head as an offering and fulfillment of their duty before turning themselves in. They had to hurry. Word of their deed had spread quickly throughout the town, and when it reached Lord Sama, he would have surely sent his men to cut them down. But they soon discovered that apart from him, everyone else was very impressed with their actions. It was, after all, what was expected of a true samurai. Word even reached a chief daimyo named Matsudara Aki, a former superior of the Asano clan, who was greatly pleased with the Ronin and sent his own guards to ensure their protection on the road to Takanawa. When the men reached the palace of the Prince of Sendai, he too was satisfied with their actions and invited them to eat, drink, and rest before continuing on their journey. And so the 47 Ronin reached their destination safely and performed the offering, and they said prayers at their master's tomb. Except that the 47 Ronin were actually 46. One of the Ronin, named Terasaka Kichimon, had been absent from the procession to the temple, although what exactly had happened to him remains something of a mystery. He didn't die in the fight, and he also didn't commit seppuku alongside the rest of the Ronin because he lived to the ripe old age of 83. Mitford makes no mention of him in his version of events, although subsequent stories suggest that Terasaka, because he was the lowest in rank, was dispatched as a messenger to travel to the Ako domain and tell Asano's family what had happened. However, some historical documents indicate that the Ronin may have simply fled before the attack and abandoned the raid altogether, which is why he wasn't sentenced to death like all the others. This goes against the triumphant, heroic tale of the 47 Ronin, though, and because there is nothing conclusive to support it, this part of the story usually gets just forgotten in the retellings. As far as the other 46 Ronin were concerned, what they expected to happen, it happened. They were arrested and sentenced to death. However, because many saw their actions as righteous and justified, they were not executed as criminals, but were allowed to commit seppuku. Afterwards, they were all buried at Sengaku-ji next to their lord. The 47th Ronin joined them upon his later death. Their graves became a popular place of pilgrimage, and one of the many people who came to pay respects was the same Satsuma man who once kicked and spat on Aishi in the street when he thought the Ronin had become a drunkard unworthy of the name of samurai. He apologized for his insult and offered atonement by taking out a dagger and stabbing himself in the stomach, dying in front of Aishi's grave. This wasn't a unique case. Mitford also mentions a samurai who, almost 170 years later, committed seppuku before the grave of Oishi Chikara because he was refused entry into a clan. In modern times, there is a festival at Sengaku Temple every December the 14th. Not as many cases of suicide nowadays, but people still turn up to help commemorate the tale of the 47 Ronin. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below and don't forget to subscribe. Brand new videos just like this every day of the week. For more from me, why not check out another channel I do called Business Blaze? It's a little bit different to this. It's a more casual format and it's about business. So in fact, it's completely different to this, but maybe you'll like it as well. Maybe you won't. You'll only find out if you click below. And thank you for watching.